Colleagues, I want to bring this meeting to order, and pursuant to Standing Order 1082, a briefing with the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Latvian Parliament. And before us is the Foreign Affairs Chair, Mr. Kalinic, and he's going to, Kalinic? Getting in close, Boris, I know. But I'm going to ask the Chair to introduce himself officially for the record, and then we're going to turn the floor over to him for some remarks, and then we're going to go into questions. So before I do that, I just want to, again, for those who are following this, the Foreign Affairs Committee here in Canada has been inviting our colleagues from Foreign Affairs Committees in other countries to make presentations. It gives us an opportunity to better understand the issues that other countries are dealing with that are priorities, and to let Canadians know just how that's all evolving and how it relates to us as Canadians. And so, on behalf of the committee, Mr. Chair, I want to welcome you here, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you. And as I said, start with your full title and name, and then we're going to turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ojārs Ēriks Kalniņš. I am a member of the Latvian Parliament, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Latvian Parliament. I also head our delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where I am chairman of the Political Committee. It is a great honor to be back in Canada. I had the pleasure of being here a year ago with our speaker. In particular, it's a pleasure, perhaps it's almost belated, but it's a pleasure for me to be able to congratulate Canada on its 150th anniversary. As you may know, Latvia will celebrate our 100th anniversary next year. It's the 100th anniversary of our republic. It's a very big event, although when we look back at our history, unfortunately 50 of those 100 years we were under foreign occupation. Yet, I think if we look back at the last 27, since we restored independence in 1991, they have been remarkably successful. People within the country are always unhappy. They always think things should be better. But I think if we look at what we've achieved in the last 27 years since rejoining the world community, there's a great deal that we can be pleased with, proud of, and it's very good to be back. When I look at the last 27 years, I divide it into three periods. The 90s, I served as ambassador in Washington, D.C. for Latvia. And during the 90s, our basic preoccupation was returning to the world community, reestablishing our diplomatic ties, joining organizations like the United Nations, and basically making our presence known. By the late 90s, the early 2000s, we became actively candidate countries. And our two priorities were to join NATO and to join the European Union. And so everything we did in terms of foreign policy and even domestic policy was geared towards fulfilling all the requirements to be parts of these two organizations. In 2004, we achieved that. To the surprise of many, including Moscow and others who doubted our ability to move this quickly and achieve both organizations. And basically, after 2004, our third phase was being active members of both of these organizations, understanding what it required, how this would affect our policies, and how we could be contributing loyal members of both groups. And for the most part, it's been very successful, except 10 years later, after 2004, in 2014, I guess, came the first big shock to our sense of security, and that was the Russian illegal annexation of Ukraine and basically the Russian-supported invasion of eastern Ukraine and Donbass. I think it was the first time since the restoration of independence where people actually feared for their safety. Our older generation had lived through World War II. Many lived to see the first Soviet occupation, then the Nazi German occupation, followed by a Soviet occupation. And many of us had hoped that that would never return again after this restoration. 2014, there were many questions about how far Moscow would go, moving into Ukraine, whether they would go further to Odessa. There was talk of Moldova. And I guess to our consternation, for the media and for the analysts, the most popular thing was to talk about the Baltic states being the next on the hit list. So we went through that year with a great deal of consternation. And for me, as a politician, the one question I got most often from voters are we safe? Not will we be invaded, but are we safe? And will NATO come through? Will they really come to defend us? I would say that since 2014, that answer has been received loud and clear. Both the Wales and the Warsaw summits gave us exactly, and perhaps even more than what we had anticipated, because what we needed was reassurance and deterrence. And both have been achieved by concrete actions that NATO took. The reassurance was important for our population. Because I would say within a year or two after they saw what NATO was doing, people started to believe that perhaps Article 5 is actually sacrosanct, and that the rest of Europe and our NATO allies also here in North America would come through. The Warsaw Summit accelerated that and brought us the enhanced forward presence, which brought Canada's presence into Latvia, which is, for us, means a great deal that goes way beyond just security, and that I'd like to talk about. But just to talk about, for us, both NATO and the EU symbolize what our, I'd say, national strategy is all about, and that is we believe in multilateralism. We learned prior to World War II that small countries cannot survive alone or in isolation. You have to be part of larger groups, but also it's larger groups, organizations that can solve global problems. And what we've learned is more and more that many of the problems our countries face today are global. And while we have to deal with them locally, we can deal with them much better if we work together as groups. So I'd say that if we feel fairly secure about NATO today, that NATO has delivered, then our greater concern is the European Union. But just one more word on NATO. I was there at a military base, Adaji, in the springtime when we formally opened this Enhanced Forward Presence Battalion under Canada's leadership. And I remember standing there, and I had three reactions, looking at soldiers from 6 other countries: Spain, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Canada, Italy. And I saw them marching. My first reaction was a great sense of pride that people from all over Europe and North America were in Latvia to help us, to protect us. And there's a great feeling knowing our history and what we went through. And my second reaction when I looked at these soldiers is I hope they never have to fire a bullet. I hope that their presence alone will be enough to deter any future conflict. I'm pretty confident that that's working. I think the signal has been very clear. If in 2014 anyone doubted whether NATO would come to the defense of a few Latvians in case there was some kind of a cross-border excursion, I think now, knowing that there are several thousand troops from 6 countries, and I think next year 2 more countries will join, Between the 3 Baltic states and Poland, there are 22 NATO countries who have either sent troops or provided their planes for Baltic air policing. And I think the signal is clear that any attempt to attack a Baltic state is an attack on NATO and all the NATO countries. And I think this is what's worked as a deterrence. And so that was my third feeling, was that I feel this is a case where an organization like NATO has come through and our friends and allies have come through. We do have greater concerns about Europe. Latvia is very committed to the European Union. Again, if NATO provides the hard security, then it's the EU that provides the soft security, the diplomacy. And we look at the combination of the two as complementary, where NATO can do one job, but the EU has to do another. And I think a clear example of that is the reaction to the Russian incursion in Ukraine. Because while NATO is protecting our countries from that spreading any further, it's the European Union, together with other countries, that enacted the sanctions. And that would be much more difficult to have sanctions to try to prevent Russia from going further if these 27 or additional countries, as Canada, had to each negotiate separately. But through the EU, we were able to have a joint voice. And this continues. Now, it's not always easy to get 28 EU countries to agree on something, and that's the long-term challenge. But I believe it's possible on big issues, and we face a lot of bigger issues that are collective issues. We face internal challenges. Radicalism, extremism has risen within many of the EU countries. Separatism, or at least anti-EU feelings. And while some of these tendencies are genuine, there are always voices in a country that see things differently. I think the evidence is fairly clear that one country that's very interested in seeing a weakening, if not a collapse, of the European Union is Russia. And if Russia is not a direct military threat at the moment to our countries for the reasons I mentioned, such as NATO, I think they are using a large number of other methods to try to undermine democracy. Because if you look at Mr. Putin and his motivation, I think the greatest thing that he fears is not a military invasion, but an invasion of democratic spirit in Russia. If Russia ever was witnessed true democracy, clearly Mr. Putin would no longer be where he is today. So it's the spread of democracy, it's this unity of the European Union that they see as a threat, and now they've used all the weapons that are available. And today we talk about hybrid warfare, cyber warfare. It's not new. In Latvia, we've experienced this hybrid warfare for the last 27 years. If I were a strategist in Moscow, my goal, let's say, in the Baltic states would not be to invade and occupy these 3 countries. My goal would be to have them members of NATO and the EU, but have their governments totally under the control of Moscow. Because then you have countries within this alliance. And I think that's been their goal all along, but it hasn't succeeded to take over the governments from the inside. But we see, information warfare, cyber warfare. This continues, and that's why I'm very proud of Latvia and very thankful to Canada for being a strong supporter of our Stratcom Center of Excellence in Riga. I think that's been one of our biggest success stories. It's drawing experts from around the world, not always NATO countries. And this is the leading edge, along with cybersecurity, of what we all have to deal with. So it's something we're very pleased about, and I know that Canada was one of our early supporters. You provided, a few years ago, I think it was $1 million to each of the excellence centers in the Baltic states, and that meant a great deal to us. As I mentioned, Latvia is very grateful to have Canadian troops there. If for no other reason, then it'll improve our hockey skills. I think the ice skating rink is being completed in the military base. Although the first time that I recall when I think it was the World Hockey Championships were in Riga, Canada beat us 11-1. However, at the last Olympics, I think we frightened Canada for 2 periods because we were leading 1-0 going into the third. So that may have put Latvia on the map even before you sent troops there. But the troops have been very welcome. They've been greeted by the people. They're very well received. We appreciate their presence. But for me, as a diplomat and a politician, I see beyond just the military presence. We're very happy that we were able to be the first EU country to ratify the CETA agreement. We want to see Canada even more engaged in Europe because we look at history, and you're a European country. The Americans were once too. I think sometimes they tend to forget that. But I think also in terms of NATO, in the past when they talked about the transatlantic alliance, all the focus was on the U.S. And I think now Canada has again demonstrated that it has a strong interest in Europe. When I gave a speech in our parliament for the ratification of the CETA agreement, one of the things I pointed out was that Canada has defended Europe in 2 world wars. You've been there for over 100 years, and so what you're doing now is nothing new. But what we want to see is other ties grow, trade ties between Latvia, between Europe and Canada. We want to buy more Bombardier planes. We want more investment. We want to invest here. And I think there's growing interest, I hope in Canada about Latvia, but in Latvia definitely about Canada. So I think in the long term, this is a win-win situation for us. And just to finish, because I'm very eager to answer your questions. But again, when I look back at this whole idea of multilateralism, again, a small country like Latvia, we have regional issues, we have our domestic issues. This month we're debating our budget for next year, a budget in which we will formally achieve 2% of GDP for defense. But we are faced by the same global problems that everyone else is: terrorism, uncontrolled migration, extremism. And while we can deal with it as a country, we realize that the real solutions can only come collectively. If the EU, if NATO, if even the UN can work together. And that's why, again, it's a pleasure to have deepened our relationship with Canada and work with you. So again, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. And thank you for your great interest and support for our country.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And colleagues, we're here for a good 40 minutes of questions, so I have quite a bit of time. So Mr. Aboulatif will start, and then we'll go from there to Mr. Levitt.
Thank you very much for this quite a bit of information, and it's very good insight. I listened to you and your concerns over Europe. Geographically, you sit on the northeast part of it by the Baltic, together with Lithuania and Estonia. And I'm really concerned to hear, I know the Europeans, the Western Europe, have their own problems. They have their own issues with Russia and with the rest of the world. I'd like to know more how much you think the Baltic states matter to the rest of Europe.
Well, I think here it's interesting that when you look at the EU and NATO, I think 22 countries are in both organizations. There are a few who are just in one or the other. And this issue of the North and the South, it's come up a lot lately. But I think we've realized in the last couple of years that we have to share concerns. Yes, when it comes to our region and Russia and the security threat, it's important that Italy and Spain and Portugal recognize it. But at the same time, when they talk about migration, when Italy receives tens of thousands of migrants and refugees from Africa, they turn to us and they ask for help. And this becomes a debate, especially in some parts of Europe, of whether we have an obligation. Well, Latvia accepted its obligation. We agreed to accept, I think, about 750 migrants. We don't have experience, we don't have the infrastructure, but we agreed to do it. In the last 2 years, we've already processed about 300. Now, most of them don't stay. They end up going to Germany, they go to Sweden, they go to countries that are perhaps wealthier and can offer more in benefits. And yes, we have some people in politics in Latvia who say, well, you know, why are we doing this? That's not our problem. But what I try to point out, in the case of Italy, the Prime Minister of Italy, who agrees to send planes and troops to Latvia, is the same Prime Minister who's asking us, can we help out with handling some of the refugees? So even though they're two different organizations, the issues are the same. And we do a lot in the north to remind our southern neighbors about concerns, whether it's Belarus. We're very strong supporters of the Eastern Partnership in the European Union. Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia. And we try to draw in our southern neighbors, and at the same time, they try to engage us more in the problems of Northern Africa, the Middle East, and Sahel. It'll always be an uphill struggle because everyone has their regional concerns at stake, but I'm generally pleased. I think there's a recognition that we have to help each other because we're in this boat together.
Well, thank you. Good time. I also was happy to hear since 1991 that your economy is remarkably doing better, and that I think is a very important element for your country to continue to defend itself and to have the strength needed moving forward to the future. Where is your best ties with Western Europe? Which countries you do best with economically, or economically?
Our natural allies are our Nordic neighbors. Okay. I always try to point out that if we had not been invaded in 1940, if we had remained independent, we would be no different than Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. In fact, prior to World War II, we had a much bigger economy than Finland or Norway. They were relatively poor countries compared to Latvia or Estonia. So we have 50 years of catching up to do. But culturally, politically, we're very close. And one of our best venues for this cooperation is the Nordic-Baltic 8. And we meet at all levels. Our presidents meet, prime ministers, foreign ministers. Foreign Affairs Committee chairs meet every 6 months in one of the 8 countries. We just compare notes, we work together. I remember in 1991 when we joined, we restored independence, joined the UN. We did not have an ambassador yet at the UN, and I was in Washington. I was deputy chief of mission for our embassy. Well, our ambassador had to go also to the UN. The first week of being members, we had to vote on dozens of issues. We had no idea. So the Nordics immediately formed the working group. And every week they got together and briefed the Baltic states on how they were looking at these issues, and it helped us a lot. I mean, now we make our own decisions. But I see this cooperation across the board. There are a lot of different formats, Nordic-Baltic cooperation. And plus we have the Baltic Sea, environmental concerns that we share. And even though Finland and Sweden are not members of NATO, they are probably more actively, especially Sweden, supportive of NATO than maybe some NATO countries are. They're fully engaged. And this fall, there were Sweden had military exercises in the Baltics, which included many of our countries. So I think that's very close. But I think the cooperation with other European countries, there's also a natural cooperation with, say, with the Eastern European countries, although the politics sometimes differs there. And like I said, I've noticed that, for example, Italy has become a very close friend. Then again, right now, everybody's lobbying us to get the EU medical agency that's leaving London. And I think about 20 countries are trying to get this huge agency. And so suddenly we're gaining a lot of friends from everybody who wants us to vote for them. But I'd say that the Nordics, the old Hanseatic League, is for us our natural sort of regional alliance.
Thank you.
Mr. Levitt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for being here. And I wanted maybe to focus on NATO a little bit, given your active role on the NATO Interparliamentary Group. As part of our NATO commitments, about 450 Canadian Forces members are deployed in Latvia as part of Operation Reassurance, working with their Latvian hosts and 5 fellow NATO allies as part of Battle Group Latvia. The purpose of this deployment is to reinforce NATO's collective defence and demonstrate the strength of our solidarity with our NATO allies. What value does the Canadian contribution provide, and how important do you think this deployment is to NATO's overall mandate in the region?
Well, as I said in the beginning, I think the important thing is it's a reminder to Europe that Canada is a part of NATO. You're there physically. And maybe in the past that wasn't always noticed. And I think knowing how expensive that is, what a commitment that is from your country and your people. I think it's highly valued throughout Europe, not just in the Baltic states. Now, we feel lucky in Latvia because we got Canada. Because of all kinds of reasons. I think any Latvian who ever flies in here from above Canada, apart from the mountains, Canada looks like Latvia. I mean, 50% of our country is forest, and even the climate is the same. So, but I think it's very important also that again, it's this collective defense, and it shows that it's not just the European countries that are on the border that have an interest in trying to protect Europe. It's coming across the Atlantic, and given that in the last year, at least with the presidential election in the U.S., there were some concerns raised about the future U.S. commitment.
Yeah.
I think that's made Canada even more important in Europe. Oddly enough, some of the concerns over, let's say, I'll openly say some of the almost chaos that we see in Washington on policy issues, it's forced Europe to pull together, to realize that Europe has to we can't totally rely always on the United States. But I think it's also shown that a country like Canada is even more important also to work with, because we share a lot of cultural ties and affinities. You speak a European language, although English is also a European language. So I think it's been very important, and we're very glad to see you there.
Thank you. Latvia also obviously has a large Russian population at around 25% of the total population. What are the tensions inherent in this? And with NATO's deployment near the Russian border, how is that playing out on a larger scale?
In Latvia, we've never had ethnic tensions because, at least since the Soviet rule, we've always had a sizable Russian population. I always say there's not a problem between the Latvian people and the Russian people. Problem is between politicians in Moscow, because it's policy that threatens us. And the vast majority, you have to look at the population of Russians in Latvia today. Those who were born in the last 26 years, 27 years, are European Russians. They were born in an EU country, at least since 2004. And they know full well what the advantages are of being in the EU. Those who have become citizens, they can travel, they gain all the benefits. Even since 2014, with what happened in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, we always got questions from our Western allies, well, could there be an uprising amongst Russians? We have no indications of that. Yes, there are a few extreme voices, but they have no popular support because yes, many of the Russians in Latvia watch Russian television. They will follow Russian news. But they also know what living conditions were like in eastern Ukraine, even before Russia came in. There's no comparison to Latvia. Even the poorest sections of Latvia are still vastly different. So, no, we don't feel any threat there. But we know that there's always the Russian pretense that could be used to say, well, we have to defend our countrymen. But it's not plausible, anyone who knows the situation there. Our parliament has 100 members. The largest party is the so-called pro-Russian party. I mean, these are Russian citizens from Latvia. They're many Latvians. It's a social democratic party. They're the furthest leftist party in Latvia. But they're in parliament. They haven't been in government. But the mayor of Riga is a Latvian-born Russian. He's very popular. Even Latvians vote for him. So they're part of the political process, and probably the only reason that the Russian party has never gotten into government is because of two positions that they refuse to change. One is that they have never recognized that the Soviet Union occupied Latvia. They officially, because Moscow doesn't recognize that. And the second is that they have always tried to insist that Russian should be made a second state language of Latvia. For us, that's a sacred issue. We're a small country, population of under 2 million. Latvian language is one of the reasons why we wanted an independent country, is to preserve that. We don't discriminate against other languages. You could speak Russian, English, whatever you want in Latvia, but as a state language, it has to remain. And so if they ever were to change these two policies, there could be a switch in attitude. If they haven't been openly aggressive, but even in cases like Ukraine, they will not condemn Russia on Ukraine. What they will say is that Ukraine is a very corrupt country and that it caused these problems. Or they'll say that NATO or the U.S. forced Russia to intervene. But otherwise, no, we don't see tensions. And, you know, I'm a Latvian who was born in Europe after the war. I was a refugee. I was born in a refugee camp in Munich. But I grew up in the U.S. When I learned that in Latvia, even under the Soviet rule, we never had gangs, ethnic gangs. We never had Russian and Latvian gangs. It just never divided up that way. And then finally, 1/3 of all marriages in Latvia are mixed marriages, Russians and Latvians. So love conquers all.
And on that, we shall conclude. Thank you.
Mind as we carry on here. Madame Lavadière, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Speak French, but not enough to be fluent.
Go ahead and try it then.
OK, vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette...
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. It gave us an overview, and it put an accent on multilateralism that we also share here in Canada. Your conviction that the big challenges that we faced have to be faced together, and that is something that I believe firmly in. When I hear you speak, I thought that there was a brother kind of country. I haven't had a chance to travel to Latvia, but it really gave some inspiration to travel there. And on a side note, when your hockey players will really be trained up, we'll have a team in Montreal really needs help, so you could send us some players with great pleasure. So as you know, I think that all parties worked closely together with people such as Bill Browder in particular to adopt a bill, the Magnitsky Bill. This bill has targeted sanctions, but it created some negative reactions from Russia. I would like to know, since you're a bit closer, or much closer, to the situation, do you have any advice to give us with regard to Canada's relationship with Russia? How should we be acting? What should we do to improve the situation? Thank you.
Thank you. I think in our region, the people who are familiar with dealing with Russia, the usual response is you have to have a firm hand. You have to show that you believe in your convictions and you'll stand up for them. Because I think at least history has shown in recent years that Russia will back off. I recall when we were candidates for NATO, in the 90s. The biggest objection we got, even from well-meaning people in the U.S. and elsewhere, was, well, Russia will object. They can't tolerate this. And our response was, the reason that they're objecting is they're hoping they can stop you from letting us join. And you know, some people thought, oh well, if the Baltics join, then that'll launch World War III. Well, it's just the opposite. That's what prevents it. And we saw that in that case, Russia did back off. So I think you have to be firm on principles here. Sanctions, nobody likes to use sanctions because they're not intended to punish, but they're intended to kind of coerce the other side to change their policies. And I think even though it hasn't totally worked with Ukraine, it's the only weapon we have. Nobody's going to actually invade and try to solve this militarily. The Magnitsky Act, I will be honest, I'm meeting with Bill Browder later today. And this issue has come up in Latvia before. And part of the reason why I think it wasn't addressed a few years ago is because we have this large Russian community. And while we take a strong stand on Ukraine and Crimea, there's always trying to find a balance. We have trade with Russia. 80% of Russia's rail, or 80% of our rail and port business comes through Russia. We want normal relations, but we will take a stand on principle when they're violating somebody's territorial integrity. But I think after this visit, now that Canada has passed this law, and I know that some of my colleagues in Parliament may want to raise this again, so I'm going to talk to Bill Browder today. We'll look at the details, and I suspect I will raise this issue in my committee in the coming month to see if we could address this again and see it's useful. Will Russia react to it? Probably. But it was interesting with the sanctions on Ukraine. Yes, there were reverse sanctions in the case of Latvia, but we noticed they were very selective. 2 Latvian exports to Russia, which were not touched, were alcohol and sardines, or what we call šprots, our Latvian sardines, because they're too popular in Russia. So they weren't sanctioned. Also, most of the rail traffic wasn't sanctioned. So Russia can be selective, and it may be a symbolic response, but I think you have to stand firm on that, because again, it's not to punish, and it's not because people hate Russia, but it's because they're behaving badly, and they need to if they want to rejoin the world community, there are certain civilized rules that we need to abide by, and we need to remind them of that.
Vous avez...
Also, you spoke about challenges that Europe is facing, cyber attacks and things like that, but there's also domestic challenges within Europe, social challenges with the rise of extremism, and challenges such as Brexit, obviously. How do you see the way forward for Europe? How will they be able to face these various challenges? Thank you.
I was very encouraged this year by the French election and also the German election, although an extreme party did get in, but at least Angela Merkel is still there. Even in the Netherlands, it seemed like some of the extreme parties, which everyone feared would suddenly get into prominence, have subsided. And we're hoping that this trend toward moderation will continue elsewhere. We don't have a problem with extremism in Latvia. In that sense, we're a very moderate country. But we do fear this kind of populism, and even in the UK, one of the reasons for Brexit was this fear of immigration, of uncontrolled immigration. I think one way we have to battle this is we have to do a better job on this information warfare and dealing with our social media space, because so much disinformation is being spread that way. And people, even about the migration, when it was 2 years ago when there were thousands of these African refugees coming into Europe, and there were rumors spread about mass rapes and other actions were later on proven to be totally false. And here I think when we talk about strategic communications and dealing with information warfare, you can't banish lies. You can only defeat them. You can't censor information, but you have to do a better job of educating your own public. And I think that's one of our challenges, is that Russia Today is everywhere. But does everyone know who Russia Today is? And they call themselves RT. Some people confuse it with ET, Entertainment Tonight. And since they do such a good job in having local announcers and so on. So I think part of the challenge on these issues to fight populism is to educate people that extreme solutions really don't solve anything, and that people have to be more critical in their analysis of the information they're getting. And to show that reasonable responses are the only way to go, because extremism is not going to solve anything. And all it does, extremism on one side just accelerates it on the other side.
Mr. Sani, please.
Welcome again, Mr. Kalnich. Thank you very much for being here today. I also want to thank you personally for your hospitality when we were in Latvia. One of the things that we saw on that Eastern European trip was the effect of the propaganda mechanism of certain countries, especially when in many of those countries the media was owned by certain actors. There's the opportunity of economic information propaganda. I mean, there's the linkage of the Orthodox churches and the Russian Orthodox Church also. And, you know, one of the things that we were told, and we were also, we had the opportunity to be at Stratcom, and we had a briefing there. We were shown fake news, fake commercials, Facebook posts, Twitter accounts, things like that. So having Canada there and being warned that, you know, obviously there would be a deluge of you know, messaging that would be negative. How has the local population reacted to that, and what is the Latvian government doing specifically to counteract that kind of messaging that's coming through, especially because it's a small country and there's certain media companies that are aligned to certain groups, not only in Latvia but in that region? How do you counter that?
Since most Latvians, I'm one of the few who doesn't speak Russian, but most Latvians understand and speak Russian, and they can also watch Russian television. And in a way, they're used to this. They've seen it for the last 26 years, anti-Latvian propaganda in the Russian media. So in a sense, they're more sophisticated about this, and they know how to counter it. I think where we have to work is to do a better job of communicating to the Russian-speaking population. It's the older generation. The younger generation of Russians speak English. They speak French. They're more cosmopolitan. It's the former Soviets, the older folks who chose not to become citizens, who just speak Russian. They read this and hear this propaganda and they believe it, except that they're not in a position to act on it. And I think there, we also have to work with the political parties, and even the Harmony Center, our left-wing party. I mean, they're aware of it, they acknowledge it, and we have to work with them to just get this information out. I think our media, our problem with the media is not so much always Russian propaganda in the Latvian media. It's the fact that many of the media are owned by wealthy people who have political interests, but that's local politics. They may support one party over another. We have an ongoing struggle with transparency in media ownership. And that's where, interestingly enough, now the social media is overshadowing that more and more. And even in Latvia, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, or we have our own form of Facebook in Latvian, and a lot of people are dealing with that. But see, that's where we've got to counter that, because you can deal with the traditional media and expose lies and misinformation, but it's a lot tougher with the stuff that goes viral. But so far, we haven't had that problem. I think in that sense, people in Latvia have a pretty good idea of what is Russian propaganda, and accept that. Just on a European level, one thing I'm very pleased about is that apart from the NATO Excellence Center on Stratcom, we had the presidency of the EU in 2015, and one of the things we introduced, and Federica Mogherini, the High Representative on foreign policy there, accepted this, that they established a Center for Strategic Communication. It's the Stratcom Task Force East. And they're starting to work on this, and it's providing more and more information through Facebook about false news, about this disinformation. So they're doing it on that level.
The second question I had, and this question has come up through your remarks, is about the EU. And so I want to discuss something, because there was something that the foreign minister, excuse me if I pronounce his name wrong, is Rinkovich?
Yeah, Ninkevich, yes.
Ninkevich. He was at a conference this year in Riga, and he mentioned something that was very interesting to me. He said that NATO and EU membership should be complementary. But we have a certain situation right now in Europe where you have 4 countries, as you know, part of the Visegrad nation, that are tilting rightward. You have Serbia that wants to join the EU, but wants to maintain military neutrality, does not want to join NATO. You have 3 other countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, that want to join the EU. You have Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus that don't want to join the EU. So when you look at the totality of the continent itself, I mean, and you mentioned right now there's 22 countries that have NATO
Both,
and
yeah.
EU joint membership. What do you think the future will hold? Because it seems to me that if you looked at the aspirations of the European countries, most of them wanted to join the EU, and I think Russia was not as concerned as long as they didn't join NATO. So somehow now they've joined the EU, now some of them want to join NATO, and I think Montenegro is the last country per se that's going to join NATO. So how do you see the continent going forward when you have a disparity between some countries that want the economic union and the advantages of the economic union, but don't necessarily want the military options also, and especially Serbia specifically, because they've said we want the economic benefits, but we want to maintain the military neutrality. So how are you going to reconcile all of those factors to make sure that the near abroad, especially, that were affected by Russia, will still maintain their ability to aspire to what they want to achieve?
Well, here I agree with the foreign minister that they need to be complementary, where each one fills a different role. I think Finland and Sweden are a good example of how this can work well, where they are both EU members but not NATO members, and yet there's very good cooperation. I think we have to be flexible. We have to allow for both. And definitely when it comes to the Eastern European or the Eastern Partnership countries or the Balkan countries, you can't force them into a mold. We have to, one of the things we're pushing with the Eastern Partnership is this differentiation, is working with each country and providing them as much support as they want. Belarus doesn't want to join the EU yet, but they want to maintain contacts. They want to be in touch with us. Georgia would love to join both, but it looks like NATO is out of the question for a while. So I think even with Serbia, anything that would bring Serbia closer to the EU, I think, is in our interests. And maybe NATO isn't necessary for them in the future. As far as I can see, further NATO expansion for the time being doesn't look like a reality. If you talk to the Swedes, if it was up just to the politicians, they would join. The public hasn't totally come around, although the polls show that it's moving in that direction. But maybe it isn't necessary because it could be looked upon as a provocation to Russia. I remember over the Ukraine issue, it always angered me when people said that, well, Russia moved in on Ukraine because they were going to join NATO. Well, that was nonsense. That wasn't the issue. It was the EU. But it wasn't NATO. I don't think anyone in NATO is looking at Ukraine in the near future as a possibility. Long term, perhaps, if a lot changes. So, and this is where we're among the countries that's pushing for greater EU-NATO cooperation. And this is where we have to work out where we can cooperate. STRATCOM is a good example where it works very well. In terms of military purchases, perhaps Europe needs to work together. We're looking at more of combined joint purchases. It's not easy. Even in the Baltic states, it's been a 20-year project to try to get the 3 Baltic states to buy equipment together. And I think that can work, and you don't have to be a NATO member to do that. So I think both organizations have to coexist, but their functions have to be clearly defined, where each does what, and they have to cooperate at the top level and also at lower levels.
Thank you. Mr. Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chair. We had a good conversation last night as well. As we all know that CETA came into effect last year with the European Union and all that. We as Canadians are a trading nation. We are trading with Latvia, but very small. In 2015, it was 0.17% product came in, and 0.16 actually went out of Canada. You did touch maple syrup last night, and this morning you touched Bombardier. I mean, how can we enhance the trade relationship? What's the mindset of your government? I mean, is it closer for you to deal with the European countries because of the freight? Or you have particular mindset to deal with Canada in the future?
I think the government is totally committed to expanding trade ties with Canada. The geographic location isn't the only factor. Yes, the European countries are closer. One of the countries that we've expanded trade ties with is China. We're exporting dairy products to China, also fish, and China is looking to expand that. So I think distance isn't necessarily the issue. We have to find, our companies have to find joint interests. And I think Canada has a great reputation internationally. I used to deal a lot in nation branding and study this, and Canada always came in #1 as one of the most favored countries in the world in terms of symbolism and just your good reputation. So I think for Latvians, the idea of Canadian products would be positive. They just need to learn more about them and what they can be. We're also looking at maybe exports here, but I think for us we're very high on IT. We have some very qualified people. We do a lot of electrical parts and machinery. We just have to find those niche areas where we can fit in. I remember many years ago, a big deal was made over the fact that some Latvian investors bought a Canadian company that was called Aerodium. And if you're familiar with Aerodium, they were the people who invented these turbines that allow people to do parachuting. It's the wind turbines that raise people up in the air, and it was a Canadian inventor who created this. Some of our engineers worked with him and developed it further, and when that company was ready to sell, they decided to sell to these Latvians. And they've been exporting this product around the world to countries, because I guess some countries use it to train their paratroopers, others put them into amusement parks. So I think if we can find these niche areas of cooperation, it's definitely a growth area. And I'm not a businessman. I know less about it, but I know that at least psychologically, people are really open to it, because Canada has a great reputation, and also tourism. We can promote that more. And so, flying here,
We're open, by the way.
yes, and you have mountains, you have skiing, you have a lot of the same kind of climate situations that we have, but I think it's bigger.
But to
Much
take it
bigger.
back, actually, we have the best agriculture products in Canada, and the agriculture practices in Canada is well known in the world. So that's something to look at, the best beef and the grains. And you mentioned you have enough wood in your country. So another thing we have in our country is softwood lumber.
Yes.
Since America is playing a little funny. I mean, it gives us the opportunity to go in different part of the world. So we're very open when it comes down to trade. One more. No?
Sadu, we're going to have to wrap this up. I wanted to thank Mr. Kalnic for his presentation and the good questions by our colleagues. As you can tell, our relationship with Latvia is very strong, and there's a lot more work to be done. So I really do want to thank you on behalf of the committee. Looking forward to more encounters like this, both abroad and here in Canada. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you. Colleagues, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and that'll give us a chance to do what we always want to do, which is get our picture taken with foreign dignitaries, and then we'll go to the next hour and presentations on C-47. So thank you very much, Mr.
Merci.
Merci.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, no, you're not. I want to bring this meeting to order. And so this is pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, October 3rd, 2017, Bill C-47, an act to amend the Export and Import Permits Act and the Criminal Code. Amendments permitting the accession to the Arms Trade Treaty and other amendments. So before us, I guess it's this afternoon now, Rideau Institute on International Affairs and its president, Peggy Mason, and Amnesty International Canada, Alex Neve, for the Secretary General. We want to welcome both of you. Now, as usual, we'll allow you to make a presentation, and then we'll go straight to questions. So whoever's decided to go first, and it's Alex, then the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon. 2 minutes into the afternoon, members of the committee. 2 years ago, I was on the ground in the isolated Sudanese state of South Kordofan, where civilians have been cut off from the world since 2011, while the Sudanese armed forces carry out an unrelenting campaign of aerial bombardment, rolling unguided barrel bombs indiscriminately out of the back of Antonov aircraft, killing and maiming thousands of civilians, forcing hundreds of thousands to flee their homes, and provoking a terrible food crisis as farmers have been too terrified to plant or harvest their crops. One elderly woman, describing to me a terrible attack that had killed several members of her family, asked me a simple, heartbreaking, glaringly obvious question to which, sadly, there was absolutely no reassuring, obvious answer. Who keeps giving them the bombs and why? That is why we are here today, of course. Amnesty International welcomes this opportunity to appear as part of your deliberations regarding Bill C-47, intended to lay the ground for Canadian accession to the UN Arms Trade Treaty. And let me state at the outset, I'm sure it's obvious, but it's worth repeating, that Amnesty International is a strong proponent and supporter of Canadian accession to the Arms Trade Treaty, a welcome promise we note that Canada repeated before the UN General Assembly's first committee just 10 days ago. For decades, Amnesty International has been documenting massive human rights violations around the world associated with the arms trade, which we have often called the world's most deadly commerce. That is why we and countless other organizations campaigned for years for the adoption of the Arms Trade Treaty to establish a vital global principle that no state can be permitted to transfer to another state arms which will be used to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. We enthusiastically welcomed the adoption of the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013 and have pressed governments since then to ratify and accede to this important new international human rights treaty and to adopt laws to fully implement its terms. In 4.5 years, 92 states, nearly 1/2 of the world's nations, and that's pretty fast in UN speed, have now become parties to the treaty, including many of our closest allies. Canada's accession matters very much for two key reasons. First, we have a significant arms industry. I don't think many Canadians realize this. Recent high-profile cases have demonstrated, however, that includes deals with countries where concerns about serious human rights violations are very real. Witness the General Dynamics deal to sell $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, and the Strijdgroep's sales of armored cars to South Sudan, Libya, and Sudan through its operation offshore in the United Arab Emirates. But secondly, Canada's accession is crucial in generally shoring up respect for this important treaty. In situations of armed conflict and mass human rights violations around the world, we continue to document a virtual flood of arms from outside the country concerned. Myanmar's Rohingya crisis, Yemen, South Sudan, Iraq, Syria being some of the most obvious contemporary examples. There is no global arms embargo in place for any of those countries, which is absurd and outrageous. It would require a UN Security Council resolution, and we, of course, all understand the politics of Security Council inaction. A well-supported ATT with global reach, therefore, is what we truly need. That is why Canada needs to be on board. Being on board, however, means doing so with legislation that fully complies with the ATT's obligations. And we are concerned that Bill C-47 fails to meet the requirements of the ATT in several crucial respects. We have joined with 9 other organizations, including the Rideau Institute, in highlighting 10 areas that we urgently need to be addressed before Bill C-47 is adopted and Canada moves to accession. And I know either earlier or soon you will have received copies of this joint brief. I would like to highlight 2 of the areas of concern in that paper. The first, that Canadian arms controls do not apply to transfers to the United States. The second, that provisions governing the possibility that arms transfers to any country will be diverted to a third country are weak. In many respects, the 2 points are interrelated, as Canadian transfers to the United States frequently involve parts which may be incorporated into weapons that are then fully assembled and transferred to another country. The fact that the United States is exempted is not of passing concern. The U.S. exemption effectively guts Canadian compliance with the ATT. Consider the following. 1, over 1/2 of Canadian arms sales are to the United States. 2, while the U.S. has signed the ATT under the previous administration, there is no realistic prospect that the U.S. will take the further step of ratifying the treaty at any foreseeable point. Therefore, 1/2 of Canadian arms sales go to a country that is not bound by the treaty. 3, there are very real concerns about U.S. arms transfers. Here are just 2 examples from our work. In May, the United States announced $110 billion worth of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, including $4.6 billion worth of guided air-to-ground munitions. 104,000 of those types of bombs have been used routinely by Saudi forces in the war in Yemen, where we have documented extensive war crimes. Also in May, we released a report highlighting a U.S. Department of Defense audit that revealed that the United States was not able to account for $1 billion worth of weapons that had been transferred to Iraq and Kuwait, including tens of thousands of assault rifles, hundreds of mortar rounds, and hundreds of Humvee armored vehicles. We have documented how, in the face of these lax controls and deficient record keeping, arms manufactured in the United States regularly wind up in the hands of armed groups, paramilitary militias, and even the Islamic State throughout Iraq. The fourth reason that we need to be concerned about the United States is simply considering the numbers. In 2015, Canada exported just over $51 million worth of parts and components for small arms and light weapons to the United States. This is not pocket change. We have no way of knowing what happened to those parts. Did they remain in U.S. hands, or were they re-exported in fully assembled weapons to some other country? This is a very real concern with arms transfers anywhere in the world, and it's why there's a specific provision in the ATT, Article 11, requiring states to take measures to prevent what's known as diversion. Canadian law requires that the possibility of unauthorized transfer or diversion to another country be considered, but does not contain any clear prohibitions, and Bill C-47 does not remedy that shortcoming. So in short, Amnesty International urges this committee to propose amendments that will ensure that Canadian arms controls do apply to sales and transfers to the United States, and that Bill C-47 incorporate measures that will fully comply with ATT Article 10 dealing with diversion. We also urge amendments to address other concerns highlighted in our joint briefing paper, including the need to ensure Bill C-47 will apply to the Department of National Defence and to the Canadian Commercial Corporation, and that existing provisions giving Cabinet broad powers to authorize any arms transfer, regardless of human rights concerns, be strictly limited. Finally, you will note that many of our concerns relate to vital matters going to the heart of our ability to meet ATT obligations, but which are not addressed in the terms of Bill C-47 and are left for regulations to be adopted at a later stage. That includes the absolutely central matter of what factors will be taken into account when assessing the risk that a particular arms transfer may violate the ATT. Those factors, we would suggest to you, are too important to be left to regulation. They require and deserve your attention and scrutiny as parliamentarians and should be part of the Act itself. Who keeps giving them the bombs? Canadian accession to the ATT is a step we look forward to celebrating at an early date. It will be welcomed around the world. It must, however, be on the basis of a legal framework that demonstrates full compliance with ATT obligations. We are certainly ready to work with you and with government officials to make the changes that will ensure that is the case. Thank you very much.
Mr. Neve, Ms. Mason, please.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to address the committee on this most important legislation. I fully support the comments just made by Alex Neve, and will pick up from where he left off. My work toward achieving robust Canadian and international standards for the export of military equipment starts with my time as an international security policy advisor on the staff of the then Foreign Minister Joe Clark, when he was shepherding through Cabinet new guidelines for Canada's military exports, which became known as the 1986 Policy Guidelines. They are still in effect today and can be found in the regulations to the Export-Import Permit Act, which I'll call EIPA from now on to save time, conveniently collated in the Export Controls Handbook. Let me quote the human rights criteria in those guidelines. Quote, under present policy guidelines set out by Cabinet in 1986, Canada closely controls the export of military items to countries whose governments have a persistent record of serious violations of the human rights of their citizens, unless it can be demonstrated that there is no reasonable risk that the goods might be used against the civilian population. We had high hopes when the 1986 guidelines were established that Canada would set a global standard for responsible arms exports. Beginning in the 1990s, however, the human rights guideline became more honored in the breach than in its observation, with more and more military equipment going to Saudi Arabia, precisely the destination the 1986 guidelines were meant to avoid. So what went wrong? The answer is very simple and equally easy to fix. The 1986 guidelines, like other criteria in the EIPA itself, are not mandatory, but are, as the name implies, guidelines. This became painfully clear when the federal court considered a challenge to the $15 billion Saudi arms deal launched by McGill law professor and former MP Daniel Turp. But before turning to that court decision, we need to consider, in addition to the policy guidelines, because they're not, of course, the only criteria, and they're contained in the regulations, the relevant section of EIPA itself, since Bill C-47 leaves this section almost entirely unchanged. Subsection 7.1.01 of the EIPA identifies the factors to be taken into account by the minister in deciding to issue export permits, in addition to the guidelines I mentioned. Quote, in deciding whether to issue a permit under subsection 1, the minister may, in addition to any other matter that the minister may consider, like the policy guidelines, have regard to whether the goods or technology may be used for a purpose prejudicial to the safety or interests of the state, or peace, security, or stability in any region of the world or within any country. Relevant language there, may have regard to. The language used in subsection 7.1.01 is extremely permissive, and there are no legal limits placed on the foreign minister's discretion to approve arms exports. Now turning to the federal court decision on the legality of the Saudi arms deal. In approving the 6 export permits, in April 2006, Minister Dion, then Foreign Minister, relied on a memorandum prepared by officials in global affairs. The memorandum acknowledged serious concerns about Saudi Arabia's human rights record. However, the memorandum affirmed that Global Affairs Canada, quote, was not aware of any reports linking violation of civil political rights in the kingdom with the proposed military exports. I hasten to add that since that statement and that ruling, which is now being appealed, ample evidence of such misuse with Canadian equipment has come forward. The government argued that the EPA includes guidelines and policies, quote, that provide for strict controls over the export of goods such as light armored vehicles, but contain no prohibitions, end quote. The minister's, quote, sole obligation is to take into account all the relevant factors having regard to the existing legislative framework. The court ruled in favor of the government, and as I noted, it's under appeal now, declaring these factors guide the minister. It is for him to decide how to assess them and how much weight to give to each, as long as he exercises his power in accordance with the object and spirit of the EPA. The court observed that even a plain reading of the language chosen in EPA, language not being changed by Bill C-47, indicates that the minister has broad discretion in issuing permits for controlled goods. The ruling of the court concluded, quote, the role of the court is not to pass moral judgment on the minister's decision to issue the export permits, but only to make sure of the legality of the decision. Of course, his broad discretion would have allowed him to deny the permits. The federal court's judgment that the minister acted within his discretion demonstrates that the discretionary power under the EPA is too broad and that there is a need for hard legal limits on that power. This conclusion is highly relevant in the context of Canada's planned accession to the ATT, since both the EPA, as it now stands, and the Saudi arms deal are inconsistent with that treaty. Let me now turn to Article 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty. Article 7 reads, if the export is not prohibited under Article 6, and Alex and Eve has already referenced that, that's the provision that prohibits exports if you have knowledge that they're going to be used to commit genocide or other war crimes. So if the export is not prohibited under Article 6, each exporting state party, prior to authorization of the export of conventional arms or components, shall, in an objective and non-discriminatory manner, taking into account relative factors, assess the potential that the conventional arms would contribute to or undermine peace and security, or could be used to commit or facilitate serious violation of international humanitarian or human rights law. Here's the relevant part of the Arms Trade Treaty. If, after conducting this assessment and considering available mitigating measures, the exporting party determines that there is an overriding risk of any of the negative consequences, undermining peace and security or committing or facilitating serious violations of human rights, quote, the exporting party shall not authorize the export. The word shall not authorize the export in Article 7.3 of the Arms Trade Treaty must therefore be given their full and intended effect. This requires hard legal limits on the discretion of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, limits that we left out of the original policy guidelines and limits that are absent from Bill C-47. Again, with the federal court having ruled that it is currently within the discretionary power of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to approve arms exports to countries that are undermining international peace and security or engaging in serious violations of international human rights or international humanitarian law, a key step in bringing Canada into line with the ATT involves placing hard limits on this discretion. If Canada is to comply with this treaty fully and truly set a global standard, the minister must be legally obligated obligated under Canada's implementing legislation to deny exports that carry an overriding risk of contributing to undermining international peace and security or committing or facilitating serious violations of international human rights or international humanitarian law. Bill C-47 contains no new provisions in the EPA proper, the actual legislation, to limit ministerial discretion. However, as Alex Neve also alluded to, Bill C-47 proposes to amend the EPA to, quote, authorize the making of regulations that set out mandatory conditions that the minister is required to take into account before issuing an export permit. Note that the bill does not establish any mandatory considerations. It only authorizes the making of regulations that will include them. Even the idea of mandatory considerations at the regulatory stage, however, is misleading, since the considerations will not actually be mandatory or prohibitive, only, quote, mandatory to take into account, which is what we have right now in the EPA, and which the federal court has ruled does not fetter the minister's discretion in any way. This amendment does not result, therefore, in any change in the scope of the minister's discretion. The absence of any real substance to these mandatory considerations to take into account renders Bill C-47 incompatible with the Arms Trade Treaty. Under Article 7, Canada will be obligated to assess, this is under Article 7 of the treaty, Canada will be obligated to assess the potential that the conventional arms could be used to commit a serious violation of international human rights, and if there is an overriding risk of any of these negative consequences, quote, it shall not authorize the export. That's the requirement under the ATT. The legal obligation under the ATT goes far beyond the consideration of certain factors. It is an obligation to refuse permits in certain high-risk circumstances. By leaving the decision to approve or disapprove a permit to the minister's discretion, as opposed to creating hard legal limits on that discretion, Bill C-47 is, in terms of ATT implementation, a failure. And I end with a point of comparison with respect to a model law which the government of New Zealand developed and enacted. And I just end with this one section. Section 5.3 of the model ATT implementation law reads, if on the basis of the assessment conducted under subsection 2, the authority, because it needn't be the minister in some cases, determines that there is a substantial risk that the conventional arms, ammunition, or parts and components would undermine peace and security or could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian or human rights law, and the risk cannot be mitigated, the authority shall refuse the application for an export license. The key language here is shall refuse, firm and binding language of the kind that is strikingly and fatally missing from Bill C-47. And I associate myself with the comments that Alex Neve made about how anything to do with mandatory consideration of factors should not be in the regulations because it deprives you, the committee, and other parliamentarians from knowing before the regulations are, well, of knowing and impacting on the content of those regulations. Accordingly, the Rideau Institute recommends that hard legal limits based on the risk assessment criteria set out in Article 7 of the ATT be imposed on the foreign minister's discretionary power to approve arms exports, and that these hard legal limits be set out in a statute and not in regulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mason. We're going to go straight to questions, Mr. Aboutif, and then I think it's Mr. Levitt, right? Oh, sorry. Ms. Pardon? Okay, well, let's just start with Mr. Aboutif, and then we'll sort it out, because that's not what it says here.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for appearing here before the committee. I hear that we have 1986 policy guideline, Joe Clark government. We have the current regime, and I get to believe that our current regime and export and import control is quite ahead of the game on many fronts and regulations and control and keeping things in place. And then we have the Bill C-47, and we have the ATT, which is my understanding from Mr. Neve that there's 10 areas where Bill C-47 falls short in order to comply, or at least to achieve the satisfactory level in terms of arm control. But the question that led to the whole conversation is, where is the effectiveness of the ATT armed treaty, in specific, where 3 out of the major 6 exporters of arms are not part of it. So, I mean, we can have all the regulations in the world, but if the main players are not in, I mean, nice to have the regulations, but if the main players are not in, you can say 60, 70, 80% maybe of the arms traded in the world are out of control. So can you please comment on that?
No, that's thank you very much. That's a very good question. As much as we wish that the arms trade treaty would have been adopted in April of 2013 and the entire world would have been on board within a few months after that, we know and recognize that in any area of international law, and certainly areas affecting international human rights, that's never the case, that it's always a long-term evolutionary process, and that we need to continue to work towards what would be the ultimate goal with any international human rights treaty, is that we have eventual universal support for the treaty. You're quite right to highlight that there are some very key players who are not on board at this time and are certainly not sending any signals of an intention to be on board in the near future. I think there's 2 responses to that. Number one, the rest of the world still matters, even if we don't have those states on board, even if the treaty will only effectively be applicable to 40% of the world's arms trade. That's 40%, which in 2012 didn't have any kind of international governance and was contributing to serious, grave human rights violations. Number 2, we continue as campaigning organizations, for instance, and I would assume as governments that are concerned about the global arms trade, to put pressure on the recalcitrant governments that aren't enthusiastically embracing the arms trade treaty at the starting point, so that we do, bit by bit, build towards that sense of wider and wider support. And number 3, I think it's important that to recognize that it's only by continued momentum that we do build the pressure to hopefully eventually reach a point where we only have 3 or 4 key governments that are the outliers on this, and that by that point, the pressure on them to get on board becomes almost impossible to resist.
I would like also, Ms. Mason can also comment on the same question.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'll just pick up on the comment about it being a process of building momentum, and I would just refer to the Landmines Treaty as a very good example, where the main producers of landmines, United States among them, were outside the treaty, but eventually they saw the wisdom of it, they saw the momentum, and they are acting in accordance with that treaty. And I would say that it's, this is what Canada has always been dedicated to strengthening international law, and the first step has to be to set the example ourselves, and then work with others to bring as many as possible into the regime. I just wanted to make one little quick comment, and perhaps I misunderstood your opening comment, but I just want to note that the 1986 guidelines aren't ancient history. They are part. They're in the regulations. They are they are part of the current regime, and in fact, the only part of the current regime that actually has a human rights criteria. Thank you very much.
So on the current regime, I'm very interested to hear if a comparison between the current regime and Bill C-47. Is Bill C-47? I mean, if I understood correctly, seems like that, in your opinion, that Bill C-47 is a step back, is not a step forward. Is that correct?
I don't think we would say it's a step back, but we would say that in the critical aspects where we need strengthening, it is not a step forward. So the U.S. is already exempted. The U.S. will remain exempted. Our provisions to guard against diversions from one state to another are weak now, and they will continue to be weak. There is some potential that once the regulations are adopted, perhaps some of those regulations will be stronger than the existing regulations regulations we have now, but you don't know that. You have no way of assessing that yourselves. There won't be an open parliamentary process in which citizens can actively engage around the fundamental concerns that Ms. Mason has highlighted, this notion that right now we have a process which just keeps these as discretionary factors to be taken into account. And that's not good enough in our view. Obviously, we would work towards those regulations being as strong as they possibly could be, but we fundamentally are of the view that they need to be in legislation.
Thank you.
Brandon Belt, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank both of you for your advocacy on Canada acceding to the Arms Trade Treaty over the years. I also had an experience similar to what Mr. Neve, you described when I was in DRC, and the women there who had been violated at gunpoint were saying to me that Congo doesn't manufacture weapons, so every gun that was used against them came from somewhere else. So I'm very pleased that we are now putting forth the legislation that will allow Canada to accede to the treaty. I'd like to address a couple of the issues that you mentioned. I saw the letter that was written by civil society to the committee, and last week we actually had the opportunity when we were in Washington, our committee at the State Department, because of these concerns, I wanted to ask those questions and raise that. And we met with the Office of Defense Trade Control Policy and the Office of Regional Security and Arms Transfers in the State Department. And when I put to them the questions about the diversion, what they outlined a very comprehensive Blue Lantern program that they have, which is about end-user controls. They told us that the brokering controls that they have are actually put in place with the anticipation that it will be compatible with a future signing of the ATT. And in fact, they're working with the Global Affairs Canada to revise their brokering controls and make sure that it's improved within the next 18 months so that it is compatible. They, in fact, in some areas go even beyond in terms of mergers and acquisitions and sales of foreign companies, where they're even ahead of us. And when I specifically asked them about the fears that civil society here have, they said that their controls in many ways are even stricter than most countries, including what they call see-through rules, which is the dual-use technology, so technologies that are meant for civilian purposes that then get used for military purposes. So I guess having heard that, I am myself more convinced, and I think that it would be probably, in the end, more useful rather than talking about exemptions to work with the Americans and make sure that we are constantly improving and working together to make sure that this kind of diversion doesn't happen. Would you comment on that?
I think we would simply say that from a human rights research perspective, sadly, the U.S. record speaks for itself. Those are commendable things you heard in your briefing, but I also shared with you recent research we've carried out that documents flagrant disregard for crucial standards regarding international human rights and international humanitarian law. We have documented the fact that weapons from the United States are being used by Saudi forces to commit war crimes in Yemen, for instance. It was the Department of National Defense's own audit, which we then dug into in greater detail, that revealed these recent concerns that a full $1 billion worth of weapons transferred to Iraq and Kuwait, a very volatile part of the world. Iraq, most obviously, an area where there's a multiplicity of parties responsible for grave human rights violations and abuses, cannot be accounted for. $1 billion worth of weapons. So provisions that may be in place are certainly not delivering the goods when it comes to guaranteeing the international community, but in our particular context, Canada, a potential arms trade partner, or an actual arms trade partner with the United States, that it won't lead to those kinds of violations. That's why we say more than 1/2 of our arms transfers cannot be exempted from this legislation and from the scope of the treaty. And in many respects, I'll use strong language here, in our view, to exempt 1/2 of Canada's arms trade from the legislation and application of the treaty makes a mockery of our accession.
And I think one of the reasons that we are signing is so that we can provide the leadership in the world, and I think that working together the way that we are to strengthen is one of those areas. But I'd like to go to the second point, which is the regulation versus legislation. And when we had the government officials here and when we've heard from the minister, it's been very, very clear that everything that is in Article 7 of the ATT is going to be in the regulations, and in many cases possibly exceed what is in Article 7, where currently some of them do. The reason, and one of the reasons I like to see it in regulation, is because we're seeing a very, very quick expansion of the kinds of threats that are out there, and also in terms of rights. So, gender rights and gender-based violence was not included in many of the multilateral treaties previously, and they are today. So when we look at the future, you look at technology, you look at the possibility of lethal autonomous weapons and AI and cyber warfare, by having it in regulation, it allows the government to be able to be more nimble and quick in responding to those kinds of threats in terms of expanding the regulations. And I also noted that when we had the officials here, they said that there will be a strong consultative process with civil society, and there will be reporting to Parliament. So I think just if you could comment on that in terms of the regulations themselves and making sure that they're strong.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I can just quickly go back to the original question, just to note that it's not just a matter of the strength of the end user certificates and so on that the U.S. has. It's the fact that they have actually quite different criteria for determining whether an export should be allowed. And very obvious examples are Pakistan. We haven't exported directly to Pakistan any military equipment since they tested nuclear weapons using our technology. But United States has no compunction in that regard. Similarly, recent export of fighter aircraft to Nigeria, where Canada would I do not think, agree with that. So we're surrendering. We're surrendering our judgment as to where the goods should go if United States is not part of the ATT, of our implementation of the ATT. With respect to all of Article 7 going to be in the regulations, I mean, that's wonderful, except the government's own description of those regulations, which is in the summary at the beginning of the Bill C-47, it says, this enactment amends the Export and Import Permits Act B, item B, to authorize the making of regulations that set out mandatory considerations that the minister is required to take into account. Now, presumably, they mean the Article 7 considerations, except that that is not sufficient. Under the ATT, they're not just to be taken into account. They shall be applied. So that's the problem. The problem is not that they're not going to list all the items in Article 7 of the ATT. It's what the minister has to do with them, how his discretion is or is not fettered. The final point with respect to regulations, because I think you brought a very important point was brought up, and that's the flexibility. I mean, why do we have regulations? We want to be able to be flexible. I would argue that the appropriate procedure would be to have what is required. We know now that the Article 7 criteria are required. They're obligatory under the Arms Trade Treaty. Put those in the Act, in Bill C-47, but of course allow for regulations to update, to refine in all of the areas that were mentioned. And that way, you've got the core in the Act, and then you've got flexibility for adding new items as required.
We're going to go to Madame Laverdière, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, distinguished guests, for your presentations, which were very interesting. I feel quite honored because these are arguments that I was trying to make. We know that what's in the treaty should also be in this bill. And then we can always add various components through regulations. We didn't really have a chance to talk about it or to vote on this bill either. So there's a respect of this treaty that's in question, and the respect of democracy in general, parliamentary democracy, that's at stake here. I'd like to go back to the question of exports to the U.S. I know that the treaty says that we must apply various components of the treaty in a non-discriminatory fashion, which kind of seems to mean that we should apply it to all our exports, to all countries. Nevertheless, when we had representatives from the Department from Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs, a few weeks ago, they told us that there were some examples. Luxembourg can export to Belgium, and it doesn't integrate this into its application of the treaty. I want to know your thoughts on that.
Take the position that no country should be exempted for any country. So with the same concerns that we're highlighting with respect to the Canada-US relationship, we would have with respect to the Luxembourg-Belgium relationship. The fact that that may or may not be how Belgium or Luxembourg decides to handle their ratification does not at all, which we would say is in violation of the spirit of the treaty, the scope of the treaty, and the non-discriminatory provisions of the treaty, does not in any way justify that we too should follow in that path and similarly limit the scope of the treaty in terms of how we're implementing it. I would also argue that the United States as a global arms power is hardly comparable to Belgium. Canada is hardly comparable to Luxembourg. Not that that makes a difference, the fact that we're talking about a hugely different scale and nature and severity of weaponry, but it is a background factor. It has to be universal. With a country like the United States, whether or not the United States had some good approaches last year or some excellent approaches 5 years ago, who knows what their approaches will be 3 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now. The reason you need firm, clear, predictable, binding law around this is the world changes. Other governments change. It could, 3 years from now, it could be disastrous in terms of how the U.S. is handling their arms transfers. We would probably say it's near disastrous even right now, but it could even get worse. And if we've set up a legislative framework that's not going to apply to that context, then we've started off on the wrong foot.
Merci pour la...
Thank you very much for your question. If you allow it, I'll answer in English because of the terminology, which is quite technical.
I, of course, associate myself with the comments that Alex made, but I would also like to address a section of the treaty which the foreign affairs officials purported to rely on, and that was Article 26 of the treaty, which talks about essentially defense cooperation agreements. This treaty shall not be cited as grounds for voiding defense cooperation agreements concluded between states parties to the treaty. It's our understanding that that is what the Belgium, the Benelux countries are relying on, that they have a defense cooperation agreement. I, like Alex, don't agree that that's what this means. It doesn't mean not complying with the treaty. It means using this as an excuse to get out of an agreement. But nonetheless, even if we give them that terminology, that interpretation, which I don't agree with, it only applies to states parties to the treaty, and the United States is not a state party to the treaty. So Canada could not rely on this provision even if we gave it that interpretation, which I think is an incorrect one, because the Act very, very clearly talks about applying the Act to all of our exports in a non-discriminatory manner, and that is as clear as can be, indicating all of our exports. Thank you.
Just a quick comment. If possible, you talked about the study you conducted involving $1 billion in equipment that disappeared. Would it be possible, for the benefit of the committee, to send a copy of this document? Also, I have a question, and I don't know if you can talk about it quickly, about the Canadian Commercial Corporation, the CCC, and its role, which should also be clarified in this bill. Thank you.
You can start with that, and I'll do the end.
Merci encore une fois.
Thank you once again.
Much for that very important question about the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which increasingly plays a very, very important role as a broker, essentially, between the government and potential exporting countries, and of course played a very central role with respect to the $15 billion Saudi arms deal. It clearly should be covered. All entities within the country that are involved in the decision to export arms should be brought within the scope of the ATT. And therefore, it should be very clear that the Canadian Commercial Corporation and also the Department of National Defence, because it's not covered under this either, all entities, and that's why when I read out with respect to, so all entities that are involved at the behest of the Government of Canada in the potential export of arms to another country must be brought within the scope of the Arms Trade Treaty.
And with respect to your first point, absolutely. I will just highlight that while we certainly did some work around that concern and issued some public statements, the actual study is from the U.S. Department of Defense's own audit process. So obviously a very authoritative source as to what's happening with respect to U.S. arms and weapons.
Comment, no?
Thank you, Madame Lavidière. We're going to go to Mr. Levitt, please.
I'll be ceding my time to
That's fine.
MP
I'll let you know. You're going to cede it to Matt? Okay, Mr. DeCourcy, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levitt. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our two witnesses for being here today. On vous remercie énormément de tous vos contributions.
Thank you very much for everything you've presented today. We have to think about human rights throughout the world.
Contributors to Canada's, I guess, reassertion in the world. Mr. Neve, you started by talking about the important signal that this sends to the world, I guess the gaining of general respect for this treaty, that Canada's accession to the treaty can demonstrate to the world. That's the view of the government, that our role is to, in addition to strengthen our arms trade system, to contribute where we can to other countries around the world who need help strengthening their regimes as well. And Canada contributes $1 million to the U.S. Trust Fund facility supporting states in their accession to the ATT. Could both of you maybe talk briefly about the contribution that Canada can make there, and as well the signal that Canada's accession to the treaty can relay to other perhaps developing nations around the world?
Absolutely. I'm sure we both have a lot to say. And as I said in my remarks, we're enthusiastic about Canada acceding to the treaty for two reasons. Number one, our arms trade needs this kind of scrutiny and control. This is not theoretical. We know there are cases that have come up of very real concern. But secondly is exactly the piece you're highlighting, Mr. DeCourcy. It's the concern that the world needs some leadership here, that we do have 92 states on board, and that's almost half, but it's not quite half. As was pointed out earlier, we have a number of very key players that aren't even considering signing on. And so a country like Canada, who has a very respected voice globally on international human rights, but particularly, especially because of the Ottawa Treaty, has a very strong reputation around the landmines example in particular, but the notion of global arms control. So yes, we are a key player here, and that's one of the reasons it's been so concerning that 4 years on, we're not yet part of the club. The ways in which we can work bilaterally with states that aren't on board yet, the ways in which we can work with states that are on board but don't yet have the laws in place to ensure proper implementation are probably immeasurable. And we want, therefore, Canada to be going into this with the best example to the world of what full embrace of the Arms Trade Treaty looks like, that you don't exempt from its coverage a country which is responsible for more than half of your arms trade, for instance, that you do have clear provisions in your law which enact in legislation the mandatory aspects of compliance. We're not suggesting that every single detail needs to be in the Act as opposed to regulations. But there's much improvement that could be seen here.
Is there not legitimacy to the comment made by my colleague Anita around the idea of the nimbleness of regulation to expand in a quick manner the need for the minister to take certain other issues into consideration as the world changes? We've seen examples around September 11th where the lack of an ability to quickly amend regulation caused a delay in adding certain requirements to decision making in government. Is that not an important consideration in all this? And again, we know that other Westminster systems like the UK, like New Zealand, like Australia, they land these sorts of criteria and these decision-making processes in regulation for that very fact.
We totally agree that there's a role for regulation. We are not at all suggesting that there shouldn't be a regulatory power here, and would absolutely agree that there are many aspects, including sort of further developments that arise after the legislation is passed, that could appropriately be dealt with through regulation. We're concerned, though, that in essence the legislation is leaving for regulation a clear statutory statement of the central obligation that is involved in ratifying the Arms Trade Treaty, and that is this notion of mandatory prohibition with respect to arms transfers that violate the clear provisions that are in the Arms Trade Treaty. We're told that will be in regulation, and we're also told that it may be stated in a way that it's just that these are factors that mandatorily should be taken into account, as Ms. Mason was highlighting, not that it will be a statement of mandatory prohibition. There's a fundamental difference there. It's that high level that we're looking for in the legislation. Other details around processes, even the specificity of some of the kinds of international human rights violations that should be of concern here, the evolving nature of those as we become aware of new threats and new concerns, absolutely. But we need that key mandatory provision to be in the law.
Ms. Mason, maybe very quickly,
This will be the last questions. We're wrapping it up here after that.
So I just wanted to get, first of all, thank you very much for your for your comments. I just want to get one sort of an outlook from you. From a public health context, we know that in many cases, a lot of these illegal arms are in those places around the world where the rule of law is not there or there's a conflict. And we know that disproportionately, the illegal arms trade affects women and girls and prevents the building, the stabilization of the society. Acceding to this arms trade, outside of the issues that you mentioned, how do you think that will impact those societies specifically in making sure that we improve the situation on the ground and we contribute to the post-stabilization in those countries that are going through this specific situation?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the first point I would want to make is that in this case, we're not talking about illegal arms. We're talking about the damage that legal arms transfers are causing because the strict prohibitions in the Arms Trade Treaty aren't being followed. So if we could get the legal trade under much stricter control, and if the legal trade was a much more responsible trade, then it'd be that much easier to focus in on the illegal arms trade. I want to go back, if I may, just to the point about, because I think it's such an important one, about what does it mean for Canada to be back and what kind of a signal would be sent by Canada acceding to the treaty with a very robust implementing legislation. And I just want to recall that Canada played a leadership role in the negotiation of the Rome Statute, which led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and we were rewarded with the first presidency of that court because of the outstanding role that Canada had played. Robust rules controlling arms exports to ensure that exports are responsible is a clear concomitant to the International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute, given the central role that weapons play play in the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and serious human rights violations. So it was un-Canadian for us to have been out of this treaty for so long, and I would suggest that the expectation is very strong internationally that with the Prime Minister's statement that Canada is back, that means that when we accede to this treaty, it's going to be in a manner that Canadians can all be proud of. Thank you.
I would like to cede the rest of my time to Mr. Levitt.
Just one point of clarification, or just if you can give us a perspective. Both of my colleagues have raised the issue of regulation. MP de Courcy raised the issue of other Westminster-style governments, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. The issue of mandatory prohibition and the regulation. How have those three jurisdictions dealt with that in their regulations?
Well, to start off with, New Zealand didn't put it in the regulations. They've got it. They've got it in the. They have mandatory prohibitions in the Act, not in the regulations.
And for
the other
UK?
two, I'm not. If you're familiar, I don't know. But we could certainly check. We could certainly provide. I'd be very surprised if the mandatory obligations were in the regulations. It's highly unusual. I mean, I'm a lawyer, and it's just very unusual to have the primary obligation not in your law, but in your regulations.
Thank you.
But certainly we can look for that.
Just for your information, I'll get the desk to do that, the table to do that for you. I'll get you a list of who's mandatory and who relies on regulations to develop the treaty if we can. Colleagues, I think that wraps it up for both our witnesses, Ms. Mason and Mr. Neve. I want to thank both of you. Very good quality discussion this morning, early this afternoon. And so we'll call it a day, and we'll see you all on Thursday. Just a reminder before you go, we'll be starting clause by clause a week from this Thursday. So prepare yourself for that. And if there's any information your chair and or the desk table can give you, please feel free to come and let us know. So meeting will be adjourned till Thursday, 11 o'clock.